What's up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound, brought to you each and every Monday and Thursday by the Hockey News. I'm your host, Emma Lingan. I cover the Nashville Predators here at the Hockey News. I'm joined on this Monday by my wonderful co-host, Michael Augello, who covers the Buffalo Sabres here for us at the Hockey News. And we've got a lot to talk about today. Trade deadline just wrapped up, so there's plenty going on around the league. But before we do, want to let you know that we are brought to you by our good friends at Sticks.com. Hey, hockey players, why drop a fortune on your sticks when you can snag pro-level composite sticks at Sticks.com? That's STIX.com. These all-black beauties are made for sniping, saucing, and shutting it down, all while looking sharp on the ice. And the best part, prices start at just $85.13 US for a 3-pack. Yep, you heard that right. Elite sticks without the elite price. Hit up Sticks.com. Again, that is STIX.com now and gear up without the markup. Let's go. All right. Trade deadline. The belle of the ball at this year's deadline was Mikko Rantanen, Michael. He was traded from Carolina to the Dallas Stars in exchange for Logan Stankoven and 2 first-round picks. One in 2026, one in 2027. So obviously a contingency of this trade was Rantanen signing an extension, which he did with Dallas. They've got him for 8 years at a $12 million AAV. So looking at this, obviously this is seen as a win for Dallas, but where does Carolina stand in all of this? Do you think, obviously they were being praised when they got Rantanen from Colorado earlier in the year. Now it's like, I don't know. Do we think maybe they should have checked in to make sure that he wanted to stay in Carolina before they made the deal in the first place? Or do you think that this is a miscalculation by Carolina?
Well, I know that Elliot Friedman reported over the weekend that Carolina, with their permission, sort of checked in with Rantanen's agent. Now, apparently the Rantanen camp thought that this was just a negotiating ploy to get a better price to, threaten a trade. They didn't come off the amount that they were asking for, which apparently was $13 million, which would be the highest paid winger in the league. And then they ended up trading him to Carolina, and we are where we are today. Now, if you eliminate the 42 days, I think that's what it was, the 42 days that Rantanen played in Carolina, and you look at the trade and you see Martin Necas and Jack Drury for Logan Stankoven and 2 first-round picks, it's not a bad trade. I mean, I like Stankoven a lot. He's 5 years of retention. Necas is probably he was definitely going to sign someplace else after next season. He clearly didn't find it suitable in Carolina in terms of, he was playing great, but he just didn't want to stay there, apparently, or they wouldn't pay him what he thought he was worth. So if you eliminate, Rantanen going there, it's not bad. But the stench of him being traded, going to Carolina, and not wanting to stay there, on top of what happened last year with Jake Gensel, who they traded for at the deadline, and they tried to sign him, and he goes to Tampa Bay. It leaves a little bit of a, stink there in terms of, they're a good franchise. They've been run really well. They've been competitive over a number of years. But you start to get the feeling, well, Gensel didn't want to stay there, and Rantanen didn't want to stay there. What's wrong in Carolina? And I come back to, well, they don't pay people. Now, they were willing to pay him not $13 million, but they were willing to pay him, but it wasn't enough. And I don't think he really wanted to go there. So he finds his way to Dallas. It was a good deal for the Stars. Now they have one of the best wingers in the league. And Carolina has a good young player in Stankoven, but I think that specter of players not wanting to play there is going to stick with them a long time.
Well, Rantanen was not the only move that Dallas made at the deadline. Of course, before the deadline, they added Mikhail Granlund and Cody Ceci, but on deadline day, they also extended one of their key young players, Wyatt Johnston, to a 5-year, $42 million deal. So that's an $8.4 million AAV. Looking at Johnston and, his ceiling that it seems like he maybe still hasn't even approached yet. Do you think this is a team friendly contract for Johnston, or do you think this is pretty fair in terms of what he would get on the open market?
I think it's fair. He gets a 5-year deal instead of an 8-year deal. The AAV, as you said, was 8.4, with the cap going up. I believe he's set career highs in goals and points right now. He had 59 on the weekend. So he's on pace for a 75 to maybe even 80-point season. So, we know what he is. He's established himself. Jim Nill's got a lot of challenges here. He's got to sign Thomas Harley. He's got to sign Jason Robertson. You have to factor in, what do you do with Jamie Benn? Does he come back on a sort of a veteran minimum contract to stay with the team that he's been with his entire career? There's a lot of questions to ask. Maybe some pieces moving out. Matt Duchene is another one. He's played phenomenally since he went to Dallas after not playing very well in Nashville. So everything is in flux, but they're in a position now to really contend for the Stanley Cup. But they're going to probably face Colorado in the first round, and that's appointment television there.
For sure. Well, I mentioned Rantanen, the belle of the ball at this year's deadline, which means that the new belle of the ball in free agency this summer is none other than Mitch Marner of the Toronto Maple Leafs. So Elliot Friedman reported over the weekend that the Hurricanes were actually asking the Maple Leafs for Marner in a potential trade for Mikko Rantanen when they decided they were going to go that route. And reportedly, Marner was approached about waiving his no movement clause. He declined to do so, and he reiterated his interest in staying in Toronto. So, of course, this is all hearsay. These are all reports and rumors at this point. But should the Maple Leafs, given sort of the noise around this situation, do you think the Maple Leafs should be concerned about being able to re-sign him this summer, or is it just pretty much understood that he's going to return to Toronto?
Oh no, I think if the assumption there is he's gone, unless they pay him, and I don't perceive that there's going to be any hometown discount. Darren Ferris is his agent. Darren Ferris has a reputation of taking players to market, unless there's a reason not to. And Mitch Marner, in his last deal with the Leafs, he signed for just under $11 million. And that was not a 8-year deal. That was a 6-year deal. They're looking to break the bank. And now with Rantanen signing with Dallas, they're not going to use Dallas as a comparable and $12 million as a comparable. They're going to use Austin Matthews as a comparable. And I think they're barking up the wrong tree, because I don't think the Maple Leafs are going to pay him the equivalent of Austin Matthews. Now, Carolina had every right to ask for Marner. Brad Treliving last summer, I think, toyed with the idea of trading Marner, but the problem is he's got the no-move clause and he can prevent anything from happening. So unlike Rantanen, who had a limited no trade. So I get the feeling here Marner is going to play out the season, see where things go. If the Leafs go to a conference final or a Stanley Cup final, then he's in the catbird seat, because if he plays well. If he doesn't play well, then I think that answers the question. But if he plays well and they go deep in the playoffs, then he really has the Leafs between a rock and a hard place. But if they lose in the first round and he is a ghost like he was last season, he's as good as gone.
Well, with all of this talk about Rantanen and the trades and everything that went down in the last week, it is almost easy to forget that he did, in fact, begin the season with the Colorado Avalanche. And things were not looking great for Colorado after they traded him to Carolina. But now, fast forward since then, the Avalanche have acquired Brock Nelson, Charlie Coyle, Ryan Lindgren, all in the last week. This seems like it's been obviously it's been a busy year for the Avalanche, but how much better do you think this team is than they were before?
Yeah, and they added Mackenzie Blackwood to solidify their goaltending. So yeah, it's been a revolving door in Denver. I think they're significantly better. I saw them play against Toronto on Saturday. Brock Nelson looked like he was shot out of a cannon. Charlie Coyle is a veteran guy, so is Lindgren. Coyle's got a year left in his contract, whereas Lindgren and Nelson are expiring contracts. You add that to McKinnon and Makar and Devin Taves, and now they have a decent goaltender in Blackwood. I mean, the shame here, and this is the stupidity of the NHL playoff system, is that the 2-3, which I always call the corridor of hell, you have Dallas, and right now, if Winnipeg wins the Central, it's Dallas versus Colorado. Those are two teams that are capable of winning a Stanley Cup, and one of them is going to lose in the first round. And in the Atlantic Division, you have Toronto, Florida, and Tampa, and two of those teams are going to meet in the first round, and one of them is going to be out in the first round. It should go back to a 1-8 playoff system, but the NHL doesn't seem to want to make sense. But I look at Colorado, and they're a vastly improved team and could win a Stanley Cup if they can get out of the first round.
Yeah, definitely just got even more interesting in the West there. But Michael, we got to talk about it. We've been talking about them for weeks. We didn't think that they would do it, but lo and behold, they did. The Boston Bruins have decided to part ways with some, central roster pieces. So you mentioned Charlie Coyle. They also traded Brandon Carlo to Toronto. But of course, the granddaddy of them all, Brad Marchand, has been traded to the Florida Panthers for a conditional second round pick in 2027. So that'll become a first if Florida wins 2 playoff rounds and Marchand plays in 50% of those games. So obviously, tough news for Boston fans. This is sort of an arch nemesis in Florida. Now their captain goes there. But looking at it as a business decision, do you think this was a fair return for Boston getting that draft pick?
Not really. Not for the impact that Marchand could have potentially for the Panthers in a playoff run. Now he's injured right now, and he's not expected to be back until the beginning of the playoffs. I mean, this is an ugly, bad look for the Bruins. I mean, believe me, nobody is feeling any sympathy for them because they've been a great team and just perpetual playoff pests for 15 years. So nobody is feeling sorry for them, but to see them sort of dismantle that team in one fell swoop where they trade Coyle to Colorado. The Carlo deal was surprising because they traded him inside the division. He's got 2 years left on a contract at a very reasonable amount. And then the news that came out after the trade from Elliot Friedman on Saturday, where essentially Marchand went to the Bruins, went to management and said, I'll compromise. There's like $1 million in between what you're offering me and what I want. I'll meet you in the middle. And they said no. So really, I mean, this is a sad end to somebody who gave up, and this is the ugly look for the Bruins. They had Bergeron, Chara, Rask, Krejci, Marchand, all who took less to stay in Boston. And over the last few years, they started to pay Pasternak. They started to pay McAvoy. Well, nobody is ever taking less to play for the Bruins again because Marchand took less. He went, asked for a contract. He's still a productive player, and they said no. That tells you about the Bruins and what it's like now in the NHL. Nobody is going to take less ever again.
Yeah, definitely interesting to see what's happened in Boston, as you said, in one fell swoop. They have effectively taken themselves, it feels like, out of the playoff race in the East. But one team that looks like it kind of made some moves to really solidify themselves in that playoff race is the Ottawa Senators. So they made some solid moves. They acquired Zetterlund from San Jose. They got Dylan Cousins and Dennis Gilbert from Buffalo. Meanwhile, they did trade away Josh Norris and Jacob Bernard Docker. Norris, obviously a really popular player in the locker room, as evidenced by Brady Tkachuk's very emotional reaction when asked about him leaving. But again, these moves, it sends a pretty clear message of what the Senators are trying to do here. They're in a wild card spot right now, but do you think that these moves alone that they made at the deadline, obviously covering Buffalo, you're very familiar, Michael, with Gilbert and Cousins, but do you think these moves push Ottawa over the edge and make them a playoff team, solidify them in that race, whether that's this season or in the future?
I'm not sure if it puts them over the line this year, because I think, as we've discussed a few times on the show, if I was projecting what they needed to do, I think bolstering their defense was more important. But obviously, the injury history of Norris is a growing concern for them. He's had 3 surgeries on the same shoulder. He was out for a month. He came back on March the 1st, played a few games, and then he was traded. His name apparently had been out there all year, connected to a number of teams, including Nashville, Vancouver. There were a couple other teams. This is Elliot Friedman that reported this. Zetterlund is a nice ad. They didn't pay a ton to get him, and he's an effective player. I think the fact that Cousins is a healthy center, a right-hand shot center, and you have to say the track record of all players who come out of Buffalo is that they play better once they're out of Buffalo. So I think they're looking at that. Gilbert, I think, is just a tough depth defenseman. I'm not sure how much he really helps them. But from the Buffalo perspective, it's a roll of the dice. And basically, Kevin Adams was saying, we need to change something up here. I think Norris is a more talented player than Cousins. He's a natural center, and is effective when he's healthy. The question is, can he stay healthy? The downside here for Ottawa is the Brady Tkachuk situation, because he was clearly moved and upset about that. Now, maybe he gets over that, but if this team doesn't start winning and have some success, then all the rumors of Brady Tkachuk wanting out of Ottawa, even though they've been said to be unfounded, they will continue to crop up.
Yeah, definitely interesting situation there. One team that had a pretty quiet deadline but made some minor moves is the Winnipeg Jets. They made a couple of depth additions. They brought in Brandon Tanev to kind of give them some bottom 6 forward depth, and then they added Luke Schenn to fill in their defensive depth. Obviously, Schenn first traded from the Nashville Predators to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh then flipped him for 2 draft picks from Winnipeg. So considering what the other Central Division teams did, specifically Colorado and Dallas, which we've already talked about, have made some huge moves to bolster their rosters heading into the playoffs. Do you think that the Jets did enough by adding just these 2 depth pieces? Or, do you think this is a smart move? Because, what, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They're the best team in the NHL right now. Did they really need to do that much, or should they be concerned going forward?
They didn't upset the apple cart. Maybe that was the goal of Kevin Cheveldayoff, was to not mess up what's been successful. But observers of the Jets said they needed to add to their second line. They needed to be deeper and have a little more offense. No complaints about the players that they added. They know Brandon Tanev. He started his career in Winnipeg. He knows some of the players that are still there. Luke Schenn plugs in on the right side. Physical, will help their blue line. But there were a player or two out there that, and we're going to talk about Brock Boeser. I mean, Brock Boeser would have been a nice fit with them, but they didn't want to give up some of their top prospects. They didn't want to give up a Braden Yeager for Brock Nelson. They didn't want to match the price that Colorado paid for Brock Nelson. So maybe they held back. Maybe they, because they're Winnipeg and they have a tough time getting players, they wanted to hold on to their assets, and they have to do that. But my analysis of them is, this is an opportunity to win a Stanley Cup. You have to go all in. And they didn't go all in. They added some players that are quality, but they didn't go all in.
Well, you mentioned Brock Boeser, so let's talk about that for a second because the Vancouver Canucks were actually very quiet at the deadline this year. And Brock Boeser, of course, being their biggest trade ship, he's a pending UFA, probably could have gotten a lot of value for him. But at his post-deadline press conference, GM Patrick Allvin said, quote, "If I told you what I was offered for Brock Boeser, I think I would have to run out of here because you would not believe me." So that insinuates that the offers that he was getting for Boeser were pretty lackluster, not up to the standard that he expected. So do you think that those comments he made could impact Boeser's interest in potentially negotiating with the Canucks on an extension leading up to free agency?
I don't think it'll affect his goal of maybe staying in Vancouver if Vancouver pays him, but I just find the comments of Alvin really dumb. I mean, really not subtle at all. I mean, keep it to yourself what you're offered. I mean, all that can be interpreted from that is, well, nobody in the league really wanted this guy, so we kept him. That's how does that make him feel? I'm surprised. Apparently, the price they were asking for was a first round pick. Now, so many of the contenders out there already traded their first round picks. Colorado, Dallas, Toronto, Florida, Tampa, they all traded their first round picks. So, maybe that's where Winnipeg goes to trade a first round pick to get Boeser, and they didn't want to pay that price. And maybe they hoped that they could get him for less. LA, there were a couple other teams that needed a scoring winger. Nobody was offering the price that they were looking for Boeser. So they decided to keep him. But I just think Alvin regrets or should regret what he said, because I think everybody in the hockey world deemed it to be insulting what he said.
Well, you mentioned other teams that could have definitely used a guy like Boeser, one of them being the LA Kings. So let's talk about them for a minute, because at the deadline, the Kings went and acquired Andrei Kuzmenko from the Philadelphia Flyers. They got him at 50% retained, so that's 2.75 million retained in exchange for a third round pick. So this obviously, Andrei Kuzmenko, with all due respect, is not Brock Boeser. So it's a relatively low risk move. They didn't have to give up significant assets to get a player like this. So it's, I guess, good in that sense. But do you think that this was enough for a team like the Kings that has aspirations of going on a deep playoff run? Do you think Andrei Kuzmenko was going to be enough to really kind of push them over the edge and make them a serious contender in the West?
The Edmonton Oilers are quaking with fear at the specter of Andrei Kuzmenko. I mean, honestly, it's like Rob Blake dropped the ball here, really. I mean, you had an opportunity. You have a team that's one of the best defensive clubs in the league. I'm not a particular believer in Darcy Kemper, but he's played really well this year. You get Drew Doughty back. You don't have enough scoring. And you're going up against Edmonton, and Edmonton is going to have Frederick in the lineup. They're going to have Evander Kane in the lineup. You've faced this team the last couple seasons in the playoffs, and you've lost both times. How can you not say go all in, not go hog wild, but you needed to add a scorer, and there were scorers out there. I mean, Boeser for one, but there were other players that were potentially available, and they didn't do it. Kuzmenko, maybe he's hoping, because when Kuzmenko was traded from Vancouver to Calgary, he lit it up for a short span. Maybe this is an opportunity for him to prove that he belongs in the NHL, because if he doesn't succeed here, he's probably going back to Russia. But just too little, and not a good deadline for Rob Blake.
Seems like a common theme here with the LA Kings and Rob Blake dropping the ball. I feel like we talked about this after free agency as well. Needed to add some scoring. What did they do? They went out and got Tanner Jeannot and Warren Foegele. Doesn't quite seem like it's going to cut it there. So, interesting decision for sure. But you mentioned the LA Kings likely going to face Edmonton in the playoffs. So let's talk about what Edmonton did at the deadline. So they acquired two forwards, Trent Frederick and Max Jones, and they got a defenseman in Jake Wallman. So looking at this Oilers team, we've talked about them plenty of times before and what they needed to add. We said they needed primarily defense, so they got Wallman, added some depth scoring there as well. Do you think if the Oilers presumably want to do what they did last year and go to the Stanley Cup final, do you think that this roster that they have right now is better equipped than the roster they had last year in their quest of actually winning a Stanley Cup?
No, it's not better than it was last year. And mostly because the players that are on the roster right now are not having the years that they had last year. Draisaitl and McDavid are two of the best players in the world. Zach Hyman's not playing like he did last year. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is not. Evan Bouchard is not. They don't have the depth in the organization like with Dylan Holloway and Broberg going to St. Louis. Now, the moves that Stan Bowman made, Frederick is a physical forward, so is Max Jones. Wallman can play the left side or the right side. It was a decent ad. But if you look at the Western Conference, they're the fifth best team in the West. I mean, it's the three teams on the top of the Central, and Vegas is better than them in the Pacific. They're going to play LA in the first round more than likely and probably win. And then they're going to have to face Vegas. And if I had to pick between Vegas and Edmonton, I would pick Vegas. But, every team that has Connor McDavid has a chance. But Vegas in previous playoff years got physical with him, tried to limit him, and they were able to. I think they're better prepared than they were before the deadline. But do I think that they have a decent chance of getting to the Western Conference final or getting to the Stanley Cup final? No.
Well, especially if you look at what Edmonton's opponent in last year's Stanley Cup final went and did at the deadline. Not only Marchand, but they went and got Seth Jones and made some other moves as well. So clearly Florida is looking for the repeat bid there. Interesting to see. And like we've talked about before with Edmonton, they sort of, their hands are tied a little bit in terms of how much flexibility they have to go out and make those additions. So will be interesting to see. Who knows? Maybe the LA Kings come out and surprise us. Andrei Kuzmenko goes off and has a great playoffs for them. So stranger things have happened. You never know, but we will just have to see. For now, though, that is going to do it for today's episode of the Wraparound. Thank you, as always, Michael, for joining me to talk some hockey today. Thank you again to Stix.com for sponsoring. We are going to be back with an all-new episode on Thursday. We'll see you then.